Lust, debauchery, and luxury. For many, these words conjure images of a male paradise, where Eastern passions flow endlessly in opulent palaces, and the most beautiful women are always ready to captivate their master. Refined caresses, fervent sultanic love. Have you ever wondered what love and sex were truly like in the East? Is it true that women in harems had the same rights as in Europe? Could eunuchs engage in lovemaking? Was divorce genuinely easier there than in the West? And were there truly sultans who were indifferent to their harems? But before we dive into these intriguing details, friends, allow me to briefly introduce you to our book, A Collection of Delusions, 20 of the most controversial figures in world history. This offers a completely fresh perspective on some of the history's most renowned yet contradictory heroes, and it will fundamentally change your perception of the world. Was it truly a woman who stood at the origins of ancient Rus, while the famous Prince Sviatoslav was merely a warlord serving his mother? How did Eleanor of Aquitaine shatter all medieval princess stereotypes and remain a symbol of her era even at 70? How did men's intrigues transform Lucrezia Borgia into the embodiment of evil? Why is Russia's first elected ruler still considered a bloodthirsty murderer? How did Matilda Kshisinska break the hearts of several Romanovs, and was Natalia Goncharova truly Pushkin's evil genius? Hurry and get your copy before the entire print run sells out. As one of our readers wrote, reading this book feels like you're sharing a secret with a friend, and she's whispering in your ear about a truth that isn't typically spoken aloud. You can order the book using the links in the description. International shipping is available, and it can now also be purchased in Chitai Garad, Bukvoed, and Biblioglobus bookstores. I'll leave links to the online stores in the description. The Unfortunate Fate of Ottoman Dynasty. Women meet our protagonist, a real, though not widely known wife of Malkacholu Bali Bey, a character from the series Magnificent Century, and a warrior conqueror whose name made all of Europe tremble. Alas, her name hasn't survived to our time, unlike her story, which became one of the greatest sex scandals of the Ottoman Empire. It's known that she wasn't just any girl, but a member of the Ottoman dynasty, the granddaughter of Sultan Bayezid II and her husband's cousin. She was married off very young to Bali Bey, whose family was a dynasty of warriors who had served the sultans faithfully for several centuries. This was customary, by the way, in the 17th century. Sultan Ibrahim's daughter, Farma Sultan, was married off at just 3 years old. By 4, she was a widow. Her husband was killed by the Sultan's order. She was then married a second time to Admiral Fazıl Pasha, who was, incidentally, immediately sent abroad. By the age of 16, her second husband also died, and she became a widow again. Such was her fate. Sultan Ahmed's daughter, Aishi Sultan, married late compared to the previous one, at 7, but her husbands also died one after another due to political intrigues. As a result, she only experienced her first wedding night in her 4th marriage. But the undisputed record holder for the number of husbands was her sister, Fatma Sultan. She had 12 legal husbands, all of whom were viziers. Life in the harem. Rules and reality. Women in the Ottoman Empire, of course, led secluded lives in the company of female slaves and children. Girls rarely received an education within the family. Mothers typically began preparing for their daughters' weddings when they were just infants. Sometimes families wishing to intermarry would promise their children in marriage while they were still babies. Upon reaching 12, girls covered their faces with a veil and were considered eligible for marriage. They were married off without their consent. However, young men's consent to marriage was also not sought. The groom would not even see the bride's face or speak to her before the wedding. An ordinary Muslim was allowed to have 4 wives, provided, of course, that he could provide each with separate and equal sustenance and suitable living quarters. The Sultan had the right to have between 4 and 8 wives, but the number of female slaves in the harem was absolutely unlimited. What first comes to mind when you hear love and sex in the Ottoman Empire? Of course, vast harems where the Sultan spent day and night entertaining his concubines. According to expense records, Suleiman the Magnificent officially had 167 concubines in 1552. He didn't even see the faces of most of them that year, and many he never saw later. By the 19th century, their number had even risen to 900. Now add the slaves and servants, and you'll find that about 1,000 people lived in the Topkapi Palace harem. The The Sultan's mother commanded the harem. To temper any overactive male imaginations, let's clarify. Harem simply meant the women's quarters of a dwelling. Islam forbade women from seeing non-related men, which is why inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire had to allocate separate chambers to their wives, daughters, sisters, and other female relatives. Can you imagine what life was like in this exclusively female community, where women also competed for the attention of one man? After all, there was only one way to advance your career there. It must be said that many women genuinely viewed the harem as an opportunity for an incredible career. To become the wife of the most powerful ruler or the mother of a sultan, a dream, a fairy tale for a commoner whose only asset was beauty. It was a kind of social elevator. Strict discipline reigned in the harem. Girls underwent training, which included literacy, poetry, the art of dance, and of course the techniques of carnal love. The national composition of the enslaved women was quite diverse. Women from the Berber tribes of North Africa were valued for their passion, and Slavic women for their beauty. But they all went to great lengths to attract the master's attention. The Sultan, however, never openly displayed his interest in any concubine. His servant did this for him, guessing his master's will from the gleam in his eyes. To prepare a new arrival for the Sultan's bed, she was led to the hammam, where hair was removed from her body with wax. She tidied herself up and then went to the Sultan's chambers. Interestingly, during all this time, the concubine and the Sultan were not alone in the room. Servants stood by the bed with torches, illuminating the chambers. Nevertheless, there were sultans who were completely indifferent to the beauty of the harem's inhabitants. For instance, Sultan Mustafa III ascended the throne in the 18th century at the age of 55 and detested women. The first thing he did upon coming to power was to dismiss all the singers and dancers from the harem. To avoid women, he wore shoes with gold and silver nails, the clicking sound of which sent the harem inhabitants scattering in a panic. 3 times a week, Mustafa left the palace for tambour. On these days, city women were also forbidden to leave their homes or wear beautiful clothes, even behind closed doors. By the way, if the Sultan never paid attention to a concubine, after 9 years she had the right, with the master's permission of course, to gain her freedom. Her status as a free person was confirmed in writing. In such cases, she was usually found a good husband, bought a house, and given a considerable dowry. She also received regular payments from the treasury, something akin to a pension. Ottoman nobles considered such a marriage a great stroke of luck, as these beautiful women, who had received an excellent upbringing, also had connections at court. Nikolai Yorga, the author of History of the Ottoman Empire, quotes a French diplomat who served at the Ottoman Sultan's court. "Women in this empire," and I quote, "play a large role. It is enough to say that the 100 years after the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent are called the Sultanate of Women. For almost a century, although men officially sat on the throne, the country was ruled by the inhabitants of the harem. However, these were not the wives and mothers of sultans, for example, the Greek Kosem Sultan or Turhan Sultan, brought from Russia, the mother of Mehmed IV. Incidentally, a fierce struggle for power in the harem unfolded between them. The Russian one won. Secret love and scandal. But let's return to our heroine, married off at a very young age to the celebrated Bali Bey. She never saw her husband at all. He spent all his time on military campaigns and battles. One of these campaigns in Hungary served as a springboard for his career advancement. Meanwhile, our heroine remained at home, lonely, surrounded by her female slaves, and sorely bored. She was young, noble, and very wealthy, yet she lacked only one thing for true happiness. She desperately craved love. By the way, subscribe to our channel right now and turn on notifications. Otherwise, you'll miss our next videos and won't learn what life was like for serf actresses in the Russian Empire. And if it's true that in the 19th century, instead of fame and millions in fees, they received whippings and theaters were like harems for landowners, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. In Islamic civilization, the perception of love and sex was indeed quite different. In Christian Europe, sex was considered a sin, and love between a husband and wife was only permitted for procreation. In ancient Rus, before engaging in sexual relations, people would even remove their crosses. However, in the Islamic East, sex was seen as a natural extension of spiritual love. The Persian Sufi poet and Sheikh al-Islam al-Ansari wrote a scholarly treatise, The Happy Muslim Marriage, in which he argued that love is incomplete without physical union. I quote, "If you have not loved and known passion, then you are but a stone in the desert." By denying carnal love, a Muslim rejects a gift bestowed by the Almighty, which is considered an insult. Therefore, in the East, European platonic love was perceived as something perverse. Before embracing his concubine or wife in bed, an Ottoman resident would always seek the blessing of the Almighty. He didn't fear, like a Christian, that he was indulging in debauchery and that demons were flying around. On the contrary, he knew that in bed, he was performing a good deed that, among others, would help him avoid hell on Judgment Day. And if the union resulted in the birth of a child, the list of good deeds would significantly grow as long as the last of that child's descendants lived. This attitude was, in the 18th century, perceived by astonished Europeans, upon discovering the Ottoman Empire, as a complete endorsement of licentiousness. Europeans were shocked by the idea of harems. Wealthy nobles, caught in the fashion trend, even established seraglios in their homes with the daughters of their less affluent friends. However, the orgies that became popular among the European aristocracy in the 18th century were impossible in the harems of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, everything related to sex there was subject to numerous, strictly enforced prohibitions. Any concubine would have rebelled if the sultan had proposed sharing his bed with another woman. In fact, modesty was encouraged among the enslaved women themselves, and for most of history they wore very modest clothing. The low-cut necklines paraded by actresses in the Magnificent Century series would have provoked intense anger from any sultan. According to European legends, when the sultan entered the harem, the girls at the eunuch's signal would begin to dance before him until he threw a handkerchief to one of them. This chosen one would then supposedly come to his bed at night. However, in reality, it was often the eunuchs and the sultan's mother who oversaw who would spend the night with the sultan, though this certainly didn't prevent him from sometimes choosing a beautiful woman himself when visiting the harem. Tradition also dictated that those who met in the bed, even if it was for the first and last time in their lives, exchanged tender verses. Sultan Murad III is considered the greatest hunter of carnal pleasures among the sultans. Historians still cannot determine the exact number of his children. It's estimated to be between 106 and 130. His reign was a golden age for slave traders who sold enslaved women to the palace at the highest prices. The story of Ibrahim is also indicative. Before ascending the throne, he was held in captivity under constant threat of strangulation, and as a result of all he endured, he lost his virility. But once the court physicians cured him, he plunged into debauchery. Every Friday, young virgins were brought to him as a special dish. But the women of the harem were not enough for him. He even made proposals to married women, which caused widespread outrage. One day, he ordered the plumpest woman in Istanbul to be brought to him, and his servants brought him a 130-kilogram girl named Shevika, with whom he immediately fell madly in love, began to prefer her over all others, and later married her. She became his sixth and most beloved Haseki wife, and even participated in state affairs. Incidentally, it was his mother, Kusum Sultan, who was one of the most cruel and despotic figures in Ottoman history. But let's return to our young heroine, who hadn't seen her husband for years and longed for love. She was only 18 when she one day saw a handsome young man and fell in love with him. How delighted she was when he sent her poems dedicated to her beauty through her slave girl. She reread them endlessly and was finally madly happy. They began to exchange poems and notes, and one day the slave girl suggested she secretly bring him into her chambers. Our heroine agreed, and finally they embraced and kissed. But at that long-awaited moment, the door burst open, and her husband's people, who were watching over her in his absence, burst into her bedroom. Along with her young lover, the adulteress appeared before the Qadi in court. Her servants, the very slave girl who had helped her, were also brought to court. Her husband, however, was not even present at the trial, but one of his relatives, unable to bear the shame, executed her lover and servants right there in court, before our heroine's eyes. She fainted. Divorces and eunuchs, unexpected facts. But what fate awaits her? Will she also be executed? No, because she is from the Ottoman dynasty, the granddaughter of Bayezid himself, and her husband is away at war. She was spared punishment, but the young woman, having experienced a true tragedy, left Skopje, where it all happened, for Istanbul, where new severe trials awaited her. It's strange, by the way, that she didn't divorce Bali Bey. For being Bayezid's granddaughter, she could have annulled the marriage without a trial, simply by uttering, "I divorce thee," 3 times. This is what Suleiman the Magnificent's sister, Shah Huban, did after her husband, Grand Vizier Lutfi Pasha, raised a hand to her. After the divorce, he lost not only his status as the Sultan's son-in-law, but also his position as Grand Vizier, and lived out his days in exile. And in 1922, Ulviya Sultan, in the same way without a trial, divorced her husband, the well-known diplomat Ismail Hakkı. The Sultan was offended that her husband had gone to war and left her alone with a small child for 6 months. Contrary to popular belief, Turkish women were not as helpless as one might think. Even sultans sometimes feared their wives. At least that's what was said about Sultan Mustafa III in the 18th century, who fell in love with a girl during a stroll and forgot all the women in his harem. So, he was so afraid of the jealous harem inhabitants' wrath that he initially met her secretly outside the palace. Later, with the help of his vizier, he brought her into the palace under the greatest secrecy, and only much later dared to marry his beloved and admit it to his wives. And this is what Gerard de Nerval wrote, who traveled through the East in 1840. I quote, "A married woman in the Turkish Empire has the same rights as we do, and can even forbid her husband from taking a second wife, making this an indispensable condition of the marriage contract. Don't even think that these beauties are ready to sing and dance to entertain their master. In their opinion, an honorable woman should not possess such talents." Indeed, marriage in Islam did not have a sacred character as in Christianity, so it could be easily broken. However, even here, it was only easy for the man. He also just needed to say, "I divorce thee," 3 times in front of his wife, and the marriage would immediately cease to exist. The ex-wife would receive the money and property agreed upon in the contract and could remarry. Sometimes an Ottoman man, having overcome his anger, would reconcile with his wife and marry her a second or even 3rd time. However, to remarry her a 4th time, an interim marriage was required. That is, the woman had to first marry another man, share a bed with him, and then get a divorce. In connection with this, sometimes piquant stories occurred. The secretary of the British ambassador in Istanbul in the 17th century, Paul Rycaut, describes just such a situation. A husband divorced his wife for the 4th time and immediately regretted it. He arranged with the first passerby in Istanbul for a fictitious marriage with his ex-wife and a divorce the next morning, so that he could quickly remarry her. The passerby agreed. However, in the morning, the woman did not want to return to her ex-husband, as she had thoroughly enjoyed the wedding night with the new one. But what if you don't have sultans among your relatives? Ordinary Muslim women could also get a divorce, but only by court decision. The reasons here had to be serious, such as violation of the marriage contract, physical abuse, or the husband's impotence. However, in the latter 2 cases, judges were not in a hurry to make a decision about divorce. The judge would give the man a year for marriage counseling. If he failed within a year, the spouses were divorced. The end of a sad story. But let's return to our heroine who fled to Istanbul after the trial and the death of her beloved. She tried to recover and move on with her life. Over time, her wounds healed, and she noticed a very handsome young man who had long sought her affection, but managed to rekindle her feelings and dared to sneak into her chambers. As a result, the couple even had a daughter. Of course, she couldn't simply raise a daughter for a warrior conqueror who had been on military campaigns for many years, so she had the girl raised away from her. The poor woman hoped that no one would guess her happiness, but the daughter of Shehzadeh Mahmud, one of Bayezid II's sons, accidentally saw Bali Bey's wife when she was pregnant. Do you want your shame to kill all the daughters of the Ottoman dynasty? If our sultan hears even one of your disgraces, he will kill you and those involved, she said and spat in our heroine's face. At that time, Sultan Selim reigned, before whom all his close associates trembled, and the head of anyone who committed such a transgression would certainly not have remained on their shoulders. But our enamored heroine, even under threat of death, could not give up her love and continued to meet with her beloved and the father of her child. Eunuchs and scandals. The only ones allowed into the women's quarters of the house were eunuchs. But did castration hinder relations with odalisques? In fact, despite the Sultan's doctors thoroughly examining the castrati, there are documents indicating their connections with the female slaves in the harems. It is generally believed that they lacked attraction to the opposite sex. But it turns out that those who were castrated at a very young age could, over time, develop an attraction to women. Here is an authentic confession from a black eunuch. Lust gripped me, and my body grew stronger, for there were always beautiful women around. They behaved frivolously and paid no attention to my presence. I could barely restrain myself from throwing myself upon their hands, lips, breasts. Then I realized that lust, not love, was guiding me. There were plenty of attractive girls in the palace with whom I could do whatever I wanted, but it would have ended badly, so I decided to marry. And here's another authentic testimony left by a man who worked in the palace for a long time and knew the local life well. I swear that these black traders get involved with slave girls, spending whatever they earn on them and making love at every opportune moment. They say they are free from lustful feelings, but then how do they copulate? These strong, dirty black infidels. They hide girls bought from slave traders in their rooms. When it comes to their mistresses, they are ready to tear each other's throats out. I worked in the old palace for 18 years and I know what I'm talking about. Does a woman get from a black eunuch what she gets from a healthy man? If you want to know, I'll tell you, yes, and perhaps even more. 2 of my colleagues married slave girls sent from the harem. A week later, they divorced because the wives were bold enough to declare that eunuchs were much better in bed. So much for eunuchs. Meanwhile, our heroine tried her best to hide her secret. She generously paid everyone who knew about her child, sending them expensive gifts. But the secret gradually ceased to be a secret. Finally, the Istanbul Qadi learned about it. The Qadi summoned Bali Bey's wife's lover to court and sentenced him to a beating with sticks. As a result, the lady's lover fell gravely ill and died. When our heroine learned what had happened to her beloved, she went to Edirne, ordered his grave to be dug up, and sat beside it for a long time. According to rumors, she was so distraught that she even tried to make love to him. Despite Islam's strict attitude towards various sexual deviations, sexual scandals were not uncommon in the Ottoman Empire. One of the most famous is the fate of our heroine. Another scandal rocked Istanbul in 1577. An enterprising pimp named Mustafa organized a system for providing special services in the harems of Istanbul. He found attractive young men and sent them to the women's quarters of palaces disguised as barbers and seamstresses. Such services were incredibly popular among young wives carelessly left unattended by their husbands, and among widows who spent long and passionate hours in the arms of their barbers. But one day, one of these seamstresses was caught in the act, and after torture was forced to confess everything. Mustafa was arrested and his gang was disbanded. This shocking expose made husbands ponder for a long time. Incidentally, the largest number of divorces in Istanbul occurred in 1577. Our heroine's fate became known from a document found in the archives of Topkapi Palace in the 1950s. This document described in detail what Bali Bey's wife had done. According to this document, the poor woman seems to have lost her mind after everything. She returned to Istanbul, and her servants continued to bring her new young lovers. No one ever thought of reporting her adulteries, as the woman was a member of the Ottoman dynasty. However, some well-wisher was eventually found. He wrote an anonymous letter to the Sultan. What decision the Sultan made and what he did is, unfortunately, not described. But after that letter reached the palace, there was no further news of our heroine, the granddaughter of Sultan Bayezid. However, history also knows nothing about the other wives of the illustrious Bali Bey.